There's a new report out this morning providing fresh detail about a UN investigation into Israel's suspected use of heavy-duty bombs in civilian areas in Gaza. It's a report from the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, and it identifies 6 incidents where it says the Israeli military may have violated international humanitarian law. They include the suspected use of up to 2,000-pound bombs on a refugee camp, residential buildings, and a school. The report says the bombings may represent a systemic pattern, and if they were committed intentionally, that could amount to war crimes. The UN Human Rights Office is calling on Israel to ensure full investigations are undertaken into the incidents and says the findings should be made public. The report also says Palestinian groups in Gaza continue to fire rockets indiscriminately at Israel, which is also a violation of international law. Now let's bring in our senior correspondent, Margaret Evans, who is leading a CBC News team on the ground in Israel. And this morning, just in front of the Knesset, Israel's parliament in Jerusalem. Margaret, so glad to see you today. We have that report in the backdrop. We know the war continues in Gaza. We know the Prime Minister in Israel is becoming increasingly isolated now that he's disbanded that war cabinet. And I'm wondering, as you tackle that part of the reporting today, what are you hearing about Benjamin Netanyahu and his political future?
Well, Heather, let's try to break down the isolation. As you mentioned, he's lost his war cabinet. He dissolved it after the exit of 2 key centrist members of the Knesset and, importantly, former generals. They left, and with it, any kind of symbolic sense of a unified war government or cabinet. So they're gone. He's at odds with his nationalist, religious, hard-right partners because they wanted a seat at the war cabinet. He's gotten rid of it. He's at odds with his ultra-Orthodox coalition partners who have been demanding an exemption from the Israel Defense Forces, or an extension of it, for ultra-Orthodox members. They've also been demanding more power for religious authorities to choose rabbis across the country. That's something that has been in the Knesset, or that the Israeli Prime Minister has been trying to push through for his partners. Members of his own Likud partner were rebelling against that, saying that the hard right and the religious parties now have too much influence. He's also, it would seem, increasingly isolated from the United States. We saw from Benjamin Netanyahu yesterday quite a defiant statement delivered in English, saying to the Americans, it's unacceptable that there should be any delays in the aid that you are giving us. Now, the Americans said, there are no delays right now. There is one delay as Washington looks at those heavy bombs you were talking about earlier that have created so much damage to civilian populations in Gaza. And we've seen that the Americans have then canceled a key meeting that they were supposed to have with Israel over Iran. So that's a heck of a lot of isolation. And then you have the street. I'm standing, as you say, in front of the Knesset. Earlier, there were protesters demanding an end to the war, to bring the hostages home inside the Knesset. And right now I'm standing at a permanent camp which represents the hostages' families. It says, bring them home now. And we've seen demonstrations here Monday night, Tuesday night, people saying that they want the government to go, they want elections now, and they want, above all, for the government to negotiate that ceasefire agreement that would see, they hope, hostages released in exchange for the release of Palestinian prisoners being held in Israeli prisons in the West Bank. So a lot of isolation. But have a listen to this clip. I spoke with a woman yesterday who said she basically doesn't think that Netanyahu wants to win the war. It is something you hear time and again from the people out at demonstrations. Her name was Ruth. Here's what she had to say.
And we realize that the war, as tragic as it is, it's kind of like masking the real problem. And I think a different government would already end the war. But it's very clear that the current government needs the war to continue, to prevent election, to prevent the people you see around from being able to demonstrate.
Actually, Heather, her name was Dorrit. I mixed up the clips we were going to give you. But it gives you a sense of the sentiment on the ground here and that push for new elections. But what analysts will tell you, Israeli analysts, is that Netanyahu is trying to hold on until the end of July, because that's when you see the Knesset break for a 3-month pause. And they want to topple the government before then.
The focus on Israel and Hamas, Margaret, but still unable to secure a ceasefire there. And yet there is renewed attention elsewhere as well on Hezbollah. And Israel's foreign minister has been speaking about planning for an all-out offensive against Hezbollah in Lebanon. What are the new developments there?
Well, that's right. There's a lot of concern there. We've seen an uptick in the cross-border attacks in both directions in recent days. We've had the U.S. envoy in Israel, then in Lebanon, trying to diffuse tensions between Israel and Hezbollah. This announcement, or this kind of tougher talk from the Israeli foreign minister, follows the Israel Defense Forces announcement yesterday that they are prepared. They have plans for a ground invasion of the north. Again, that will be messaging to Hezbollah. This follows what was an apparent release of footage, drone footage, that Hezbollah says shows territorial along the northern border, cities like Haifa in Israel, which was seen by Hezbollah and Hassan Nasrallah, the Hezbollah leader, as a threat. And you have to remember that there are a lot of displaced people still who've been displaced on the Israeli side for 8 months. A lot of people living in southern Lebanon also displaced. And the last thing I think most countries in the Middle East want is an escalation. That conflict would be seen to go much wider than the current conflict between Israel and Hamas in the Gaza Strip.